let me start with my definition of language. So I define language as a system of science rooted in a conceptual system that is unique to each culture. So there are these three elements here: the system of science, the conceptual system, and culture. So according to this definition, basically any kind of communicative style is culture-specific. So if you emphasize, if you say that culture-specific communicative style, then we might be in a difficult situation, but because it means that there might be communicative styles that are not culture-specific. And even if you try to be as neutral as possible, I don't think that there is any communicative style that is not affected to some extent by culture. And when we actually want to kind of compare these communicative styles based on particular parameters, these particular categories, we really have to be careful, because we know that culture is distributed. So this means that I would be very cautious to talk about dichotomies. There are no dichotomies in culture. There are continuums. So we have to be careful when we talk about these categories. I was especially happy that Professor Larena criticized Goody Constant think to me from this perspective, because they have these four style of communication, and she wrote examples which shows that basically those dichotomies do not necessarily work that way. But later, when we look at the presentation, we see that basically most of the presenters try to use some kind of a dichotomy like direct, indirect, or personal, contextual. There is nothing wrong with that. We need these categories in order for us to compare particular cultures. But what I want to emphasize is that it should not be a dichotomy, because it should be something like to what extent something is direct and to what extent it is indirect. So you move on this continuum all the time. And this movement, the problem is not only between cultures, but within cultures as well. So that's why I say that the fact that culture is distributed has to be taken into consideration, because if you take a particular kind of group of students or subjects and you try to kind of measure the directness of their behavior in the request and apologies or whatever, that may work for that particular group. But if you take another group, your results will be different. So the important thing in this continuum is not whether a culture is direct or indirect, but to what extent it is direct and to what extent it is indirect, and when this kind of movement happens to one end of the scale from the other end of the scale. So that's where the interest should be, I think. And I agree that it's very difficult to find the right parameters and the right categories based on which we can kind of make a comparison between communicative styles. But it is worth looking into that, because our findings can be quite informative. So after all, I think this is something that we really need to look at. And the other important thing that I found in the presentations is that we have to be quite careful with the methodology. So how do we collect the data? Because as far as data collection is concerned, most of the time what we have is the so-called discourse completion test, which means that there are particular situations, and then we ask students or participants to react to those situations. And that's not necessarily a very naturalistic way. I agree that it is quite difficult to find some other methods, other ways. But nowadays, there are a lot of different kind of corpora available which can help us to solve this problem, to look for more naturalistic data when we actually want to compare different kind of cognitive styles that belong to different languages. One more issue. As far as digital communication is concerned, this is something that is very, very interesting now, and a lot of people look into issues about digital communication. And the presenter was right that definitely there is a kind of mixture of oral and written kind of communication here. And I think that this will emerge like a third type of communicative style, because we have oral and written, and this is somehow in between neither this nor that, or we could say that to some extent this, some extent that. Definitely I think it is worth looking at that. And as I remember, the results that were presented here from a finding, you try to kind of show some kind of continuum rather than just a dichotomy. To some extent they were informal, to some extent they were formal, depending on the given situation. One more thing about context, because if you listen to my talk yesterday, you may have come away with the impression that I'm interested in context. And in the last presentation, I particularly found important that there is a local reality there. There is a local context there in Kenya, when you talked about Kenya. And the important thing is how journalists try to kind of fit actual situational context into this existing local reality, local context. So basically how this local prior context and the actual situational context interact is a very important thing. The other important issue here is when we look at three different kind of newspapers, that there is a news item, and what do they find especially interesting? So depending on their goals, the journalist styles, priorities and all other things, they definitely select different elements from the same news item, and they try to kind of relate that to the given reality, local context. What I find very important here in these four presentations that we heard today, that all of them addressed culture from some different perspectives. And there was some common core there, definitely, as I mentioned, that basically everybody emphasized that no matter what communicative style we are talking about, that is culture specific. But what this culture specificity really means is still needs to be looked into, because this is where I think the gist of the matter is how we try to kind of describe this culture specificity, how we try to compare this culture specificity to other languages. And what is very important, how these things actually play out in intercultural communication. Because almost everybody mentioned here that, of course, when you enter into a community process, you have your first language governed communicative style. But how much of this communicative style will affect what you do in an intercultural communicative situation? So that's a real issue. And again, this is a very dynamic thing. So in a particular part of the discourse segment, you see that there is a dominance of the first language cultural style. In other parts of the segment, you will see that this absolutely disappears. So when we try to kind of define intercultures, we have to say that basically intercultures mean not only just co-construction, but the question is, you co-construct something from what? Co-construct something from what you already have, and co-construct something that emerges in the communicative process. So this is a really very dynamic process, and it's a very creative process, and I think it is very much worth investigating. Thank you.
I just want to add that I absolutely agree with you that we can't use this dichotomous approach, yeah? But when you saw it like a dichotomy, when I compared the Russian English style, just because not to overload the slide with less or more, because it would go every time. Yes, and of course it is to some extent, yeah, and in different contexts. But I just want to give the main idea to the students that it is somehow in general, to some extent, yeah, it depends on the context actually. And in order to teach it, I have a series of exercises showing, for example, in family context, informal, as Neil actually analyzed today, symmetrical, asymmetrical situations. But every time, you know, it is an interesting phenomena. I try to compare the context within the Russian culture, for example, and I show that if we, when we articulate our request, for example, it also depends who we ask, what for we ask, and so on. But every time we should make one step back. Yeah, well, we transfer the same situation into the English context. That's what I mean. That in every context, it would be more direct Russian style compared to English, and more imposed.
My only problem with the dichotomy is that it doesn't express or doesn't show that basically the fact that we say that a culture predominantly direct doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, most of the time it is direct, because if you analyze real normal communicative processes, you see that, well, you know, Russians are said to be direct, and then, you know, in many cases they are not direct at all. You know, and the other way around. Americans are supposed to be indirect, and if you analyze real conversations, you will see that they are not indirect at all. So the point is that if you use a continuum scale, then you can demonstrate that, okay, this up and down is basically the same for both cultures. The question is that, as far as Russian is concerned, you know, you will find more predominantly direct utterances than in the case of generally statistically. You know, you will find more direct than indirect in that particular culture which we are talking about, like Russian.
I just wanted to ask on that note, in terms of the scale versus the dichotomy, I thought it was quite interesting, not so much the characteristics that were specified for each culture, because I could see maybe within a different context you could have something like status-oriented, but the combination, for example, status-oriented and contact in American English would be very strange. And I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of the complex of factors rather than either a dichotomy or a scale. If that's something that you saw change according to context, or your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So status-oriented, okay, you're talking about status-oriented, yes,
well,
as far as...
I mean, it was just my impression from the data from the information that you provided about the characteristics of the two cultures and how I understood those concepts, which may or not be how you understood them, that some of those combinations seemed particularly interesting. That's not something like status-oriented, to say, for example, that Russian would be status-oriented and say American English wouldn't be, but the fact that in some situations in American English you could have status-oriented speech, but it would not have some of the other characteristics going along with it, for example, contact or emotion or something like this. And so I'm wondering if you can talk, first of all, about whether you see a variation between some of these characteristics based on the context, and if there's a difference in sort of that, the complex that goes along with it, the other characteristics that you could describe that particular language as having.
Of course, context orientation we also take into consideration, yeah, because for Russian culture, context is more important, yeah, as from my point of view, as for the English culture. Yeah, that's why, for example, from my point of view, we need more information about the person, yeah, and also it is addressed clearly in address forms, because even our names, you know, they have differences. In English culture, as far as I am concerned, you have just one name. Doesn't mean even it is Tony Blair, Anthony Blair full name, yes, but he is called Tony by everybody. Here in Russia, we have different contexts, and the same one person can be called in different way according to the context, yeah, by his parents, one variation of the name, by grandparents, other variation, by close friends, different variation. So the context is much more important. Yes, of course, this parameter is also taken into the consideration, the context. And as for the status orientation, yes, it is also seen in this interesting moment. I didn't talk about formality and formality, yes, in communication. On the one hand, when we look on the horizontal scale, which is bigger in Anglo-Saxon culture in general, yes, so here we see this negative politeness with would you, could you, and so on. And we have an impression that Russian is just very abrupt, yeah, style. And we have a perception, might have a perception, yes, that English style is formal, while Russian is not formal. But I look at formality and formality on horizontal scale, and it gives opposite, yeah, because of this low power distance. Yeah, in Anglo-Saxon culture and British culture, English style is very much informal, while Russian, with its bigger, higher power distance, is much formal. That's why it is impossible to address teacher using just first name. Yeah, but on the other way, we have differences in forms of address as имя, отчество, yeah, not just formally Professor Brown, but we say Ivan Petrovich, which is on the one hand is a little bit more formal, but there's also a level of intimacy. So, okay, all these parameters are considered. I just didn't have time to explain all of them. Yes, also I have some generalizations trying to sum up them somehow, but I just tried to point it out some most vivid.
No,
maybe.
even in this Indian context, you know, the examples that I took up in another situation, I mean, when the students say are writing a letter, you know, it's just totally the opposite. They would be using words like I beg you, you know, and I mean that would again, it would be so indirect, you know, could you please, or your honorable, dear honorable sir. So here it is just totally different. It would become the opposite. So I guess
it was not very clear for me. Did you have a control group when you did that research? Did you have a control group? I mean, a native speaker of English? No.
Control
group. Yeah.
These were students whom I had distributed.
Because they were just Indian students. Yeah?
They are just Indian students who one is teaching in the university. Yes, but they are bilingual, so they speak English, and like I said, Hindi is their mother tongue, but they speak English in the university, in class, and amongst their peer group.
And also, to actually continue with Professor Kecskés' comment, I think this dichotomizing, and if I may use Kabuta's term, essentializing one culture versus another culture, becomes more problematic when we get to digital communication and when we get to the use of English as lingua franca. And as I was listening to Professor Kecskés, I do remember, and I didn't have time to show, that the data that I have from non-native English speakers, and as it happens, most of them are based on Hofstede dichotomy in high PD cultures, but even the high PD cultures, you have different degrees of authoritative versus egalitarian societies. And so Iran may not be the same as, let's say, Jordan. And even among that, when we get the data from non-native English speakers, and this is the English as lingua franca, the level of language proficiency becomes an issue to be taken into consideration. And also, as the example showed, there is one piece in the closing that is very formal, then suddenly you get very informal terminology used after that, then again formal, then again informal, and so it becomes very difficult to actually decide where to put this data. Even if you have a ranking Likert type scale from 1 to 5, it would not be that easy to decide. So you have to break it into different parts, and so data analysis becomes much more complex, I would say, because the data is just I may say creative, dynamic, shows the dynamic nature of ELF communication, and that, but when you look at the native English speakers' data, it's much easier to categorize if you use Likert scale or if you use dichotomy, either one. But when you get to the non-native English speakers' data or ELF users, then it becomes, if I may use the term messy, it becomes very difficult. So it's definitely important to see, and then which kind of, talking about nuances of research as was mentioned, if it's the first email communication in the sequence or the second one or the third one. So how much time gap you have between these email communications, or which speech acts. Are you talking only about requestive emails, or are you talking about more imposing or less imposing emails? So these are some of the nuances that definitely have to be taken into consideration in order to talk about these cultural tendencies. And again, if you talk about, let's say, Iranian culture, if you make an invitation, the more direct you are, the more polite you are. The more forceful you are, the more polite you are. But if you make a request, which is basically imposing on the hearer, then the less direct you are. And even you use hinting in order to be more polite. So the specific situations definitely need to be taken into consideration to talk about these generalities.
That's why axiological approach is very important. That's what I was saying.
There is one very important thing here, that as if you look at the literature, the so-called intercultural communication literature, Hofstede, Goody-Kunst, Timptoni, and others, this is not intercultural, that's cross-cultural. Mm-hmm. That's cross-culture, which means, that we have categories for different cultures, and we can compare different cultures based on these categories. But the real issue for us nowadays is what happens in intercultural interaction. Mm-hmm. And these categories will not work there, because if you accept that there are intercultures that are created in the process of communication in intercultural interactions, then only a part of these characteristics will participate, in the creation of intercultures, in intercultural interaction, basically. So that area is basically something that hasn't been covered very much yet. And the problem sometimes when you read studies is that people try to use when they analyze pragmatic issues, the categorization of Hofstede, Timptoni, and Goody-Kunst, and all the others, Samovar, and some other scholars, and those are cross-cultural studies. Those are cross-cultural studies. So we need intercultural studies.
There was one comment from the audience, I think.
I really enjoyed all the presentations. Especially the one on Indian English, because I think it is really necessary to look at sometimes intercultural conflict can come up when we don't expect it, because we assume that the English language community is one, or that using certain dichotomies that one culture is very direct and another, so we almost create a metonymy. And I know that happens just within English, even like Irish English, communicative styles of English in Britain can be quite different. And I find that, for instance, I have a lot of friends who've moved from Ireland to England, and I find it sometimes quite difficult, just because the styles are slightly different. And I wondered, have you come across any situations in which people don't realize they're in intercultural communication, and what have you found there, or What was right?
Actually, I can just give you my own example. I consider myself, you know, fairly educated person who speaks fairly good English, but being in England in these last few days, I've been here for about a week, I had to kind of, you know, watch myself because I was quite direct, you know, in asking direction, and I was sort of told by my other Indian friend who's been living in England for so long, and he's telling me, haven't you noticed how the British request, you know? So in order to be correct where you are, I think these things help to be aware. But I mean, I was thinking, yeah, I speak perfect English, you know, what's the problem? But I'm very direct in asking, you know, please tell me the way to such and such place, and I have to actually use, excuse me, could you please tell me, wouldn't you mind telling me how to get here? So, I mean, these are situations which I think, you know, you become aware when you go through these things. I mean, just to give you an example of how it is. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing what you mentioned, that in order for you to kind of behave that way, you have to do that consciously.
Yeah.
So you have to control that. And I will never forget my own example when, I don't know how many years ago, a long time ago, like in the second part of the 70s, when I came to London and I wanted to buy a ticket for the Jesus Christ Superstar, which was a long time ago. And I was queuing up to the box office, and I was planning what to say. You know, so really based on what I learned, and I kind of created a very nice kind of utterance that I wanted to use at the box office. And then I went up there, I absolutely forgot it, and I said something else, absolutely different. So, you know, the point is that you can make plans, but, you know, when you get into a communicative situation, what comes to your mind, salience, that's what dominant, you know, and that salience is dominated by your first culture. That's the real problem, you know, and you say default, and Verbitska's natural meta language, you know, is right now less than 100 words. And earlier, you know, that was much more, because you have to define defaults, but based on what do you do that? So, you know, Verbitska is against Anglo-Saxon culture, the dominance, but at the same time she uses these Anglo words as defaults, you know, herself, because you have to have some default based on something, you know, the same thing with analysis of culture.
Mm-hmm. Just would like to add a couple of words to your question, yeah? Of course, sometimes we should really control ourselves, and it doesn't always, how to say, we are successful, yes, in our behavior, but at least this knowledge of differences in style helps us to understand other people's intentions, you know, because actually I presented already some papers where I talk about differences, communicative failures, yeah, which were based on these differences in style. Just one example, would you like to read? Yeah, the teacher says, and the Russian student says, oh no, I don't. Yeah, it's absolutely typical reaction. Or may lecture starts first. I'll do it later. Yeah, but even without being genuinely polite, without any intention to be impolite, because this "would you like to read" is understood in a direct way, just as a genius question about the priorities, not like request in this context. This is just one example. There are plenty of them.
If I may say one thing, I was thinking when Professor Kecskés was talking about this cultural context and all sorts of cultural preconceptions, I think, that we have when we communicate. I remember the situation in Kenya in my office at the university when I came back after malaria that I had, and my Kenyan colleague said to me, oh, you've lost weight. And then I said, thank you for this compliment. And then he looks at me really surprised. No, it wasn't a compliment.
Yeah, no, not for Kenyan men.
Yeah.
They liked.
Yeah. Thank you all very much. I'm really rather reluctant to stop this conversation and this discussion because it's absolutely brilliant, but I'm very much aware that it's lunchtime and we had quite a busy morning. Thank you all once again to all our participants. Very special thanks to Professor Kecskés. Thank you, the audience.